So Smith practiced polygamy. Why didn't he have any children with his plural wives? As a historian of religion and sexuality, I get asked this question a lot. Recently, whenever it's asked, I think of Alexis Coe's biography of George Washington, You Never Forget Your First. In this book, Alexis Coe talks a lot about the thigh men of the George Washington biography. Now, you may not know this, but George Washington didn't have any biological children with his wife, Martha. This is interesting because Martha actually had several children from her previous marriage. And some historians have surmised that this means that George Washington may have actually been infertile. Alexis Coe, though, points out that this is really hard for a lot of male biographers to accept. They see George Washington as somehow reflecting themselves and spend a great amount of time trying to explain how George Washington could be both infertile and very, very masculine. Or they'll even try to go one further and explain why it wasn't really George Washington who couldn't have kids, that something must have happened to Martha after one of those pregnancies that left her unable to have a child with George Washington. She calls these the thigh men of George Washington biography because, well, they spend a lot of time describing George Washington's thighs and their thickness in order to prove that George Washington was a manly man. So are there thigh men in Joseph Smith's history and biography? So I spent some time reading the biographies of Joseph Smith, and let me tell you, there absolutely are. Some of them are my friends, so I'm not actually going to do any quotes or calling people out today. But let me just say, if you look at any Joseph Smith biography, there's a lot of time spent on his charisma and a lot of time spent on just how sexually attracted the women must have been to him. There's also a lot of attempts to explain why Joseph Smith may not have had children with his plural wives. Some people claim that Joseph rarely had sexual relationships with his plural wives, and that most of these were just sealings for the afterlife. Others claim that there were no sealings at all. These are both minority positions and aren't held by the vast majority of historians. I can understand this emphasis. Joseph Smith was seen as the father and the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And if he is immoral or is somebody who's taking advantage of women, what does that mean for a church that thinks of him as the mouthpiece of God? In a similar way, George Washington is seen as the moral father of our country in many ways. And so his virility, his masculinity is seen as saying something about the United States. Patriotism and religious faith become deeply tied to each of these men. I do, however, think that there's a little bit of transference going on, obviously in the case of George Washington, but also in the case of Joseph Smith. A lot of male biographers wonder what they would do if they were Joseph Smith, and they have a hard time separating his actions from their own. And so they spend a lot of time talking about his charisma because they see him in themselves.